if I'll have everybody turn off their video and mute their microphones, except for Steve and myself. I'll introduce Steve and we'll get started. If you're ready, Steve.
I'm ready.
Okay. Yeah, our members should remember Steve. He gave a talk for us here about a year ago. And Steve Jett holds a Bachelor of Arts in Geology from Princeton and a PhD in Geography from Johns Hopkins. He is a professor and chair emeritus of geography and of the textiles and clothing. Jett is the author or co-author of half a dozen books, including books on the Navajos and the Navajo country. His most recent book in 2017 is Ancient Ocean Crossings, a consideration of the case for contacts with the pre-Columbian Americas. And as I said, Steve has lectured widely in the US and overseas and was a speaker at our Agave House about a year ago. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Steve.
All right. Thank you, Richard. And it's a pleasure to be with you all again, even though I can't see you in person. Tonight's presentation will be completely different from the last one, which, as you may remember, was on a huge pictograph panel up in Canyon del Muerto in northern Arizona.
Yes.
This is going to be a much more global presentation, but it will at least touch upon petroglyphs. So there's some connection, and in Arizona. We all in school, in grade school, have been imbued with the idea that Columbus discovered America, 1492, and all that. If it wasn't Columbus, it was maybe Leif Erikson with the Norse Vikings from Greenland, who came over around year 1000. My lifetime of study of this topic has convinced me, however, that those guys were really latecomers. I mean, really latecomers. That there have been interactions between the old world and the new world across the oceans from astoundingly early times. And so that is a very controversial statement, at least in the formal academia, which I used to be a part of, and still am in a sense. So I guess I need to justify that a little bit. Now, since you all are in Mormon country, I'm going to specify that this is totally non-scriptural, and it rests entirely on the usual procedures of historical and scientific investigation. But some of you may find some resonance in it anyway. I'd say that we need first to clear away some myths. There are always lots of myths out there in historical studies and general understandings of history. That is to say, general assumptions or accepted truths, givens that we've all heard all our lives, have accepted all our lives, and just sort of take for granted without ever asking, how is this idea supported? I have found it fascinating to address some of these questions. I'll first, as I say, start with some myths. And I remember being taught, I think in sixth grade it was, I don't know how it was when you younger folks were in school. I was in school in the late 1940s, so I'm something of an antiquity myself. But at any rate, we were told that until just before the time of Columbus, everybody thought if you sail too far out of sight of land, you'd fall off the edge of the earth. That there was no compass, there were no charts, no other instruments for navigating. So it was an extremely scary prospect to get outside of the sight of land. The ships of the time supposedly were just for the first time in history becoming adequate to tackle ocean voyages, because they obtained the stern rudder, they multiplied sails so that they could go faster and farther. They developed instruments of various kinds that allowed them to navigate, whereas formerly there had been no way to do that. And so that's what set things up that allowed Columbus to be successful and for the first time in human history ever getting across the Atlantic. Well, as I say, almost everything I said is mythological and untrue. At the same time that we generally were if you want to use the word, brainwashed with all this, and throughout the whole history of the United States, at any rate, there was also sort of a counter perception of all of this, and this was based largely upon the striking, eerie, even similarities among some aspects of New World cultures with those of some aspects of Old World cultures. And it was hard for a lot of people to believe that there wasn't any historical connection, that these were totally separate and independent inventions piled up one upon another until you got quite similar civilizations, that this was just the process of inevitable cultural evolution. Everybody, all people would go through these stages if they had enough the opportunity in terms of resources and environment to do so. And there was no historical relationship whatsoever among these cultures. So that was a countering view, as I mentioned, and all through time, starting with, Thomas Jefferson, who was really the father of American archaeology. He did the first systematic dig on a mound there in Virginia. I should say here in Virginia, because I'm in that state now. He, in speaking of some of these ideas of contacts and influences, poo-pooed it all and dismissed it. So he started a long tradition of dismissing this whole idea of interactions between the two hemispheres prior to Columbus. So, as I say, you had these two parallel thoughts: independent invention and inevitable evolution versus historical connectedness and interaction and inter-influence. And they tended to become quite diametrically opposed. It became somewhat like today's politics in terms of nastiness and such wide differences of opinion. And there were all sorts of implications of this. If we have time, I'll get into some of them toward the end. But there were amongst the scholarly community, there were various points made that suggested that no, there were not any contacts or any significant ones anyway, because if there had been, we would have found a lot of things in the New World that were present in the Old World, but were not in the New World before Columbus. That surely, if there had been interactions, these extremely important and valuable things would have been introduced. And since they weren't, there couldn't have been any contacts. Various things technologically were missing in the New World. There were no wheeled vehicles, for example, no plow, and a variety of other technologies were absent in the New World in pre-Columbian times. Furthermore, a lot of important food plants and other kinds of cultivated plants and domesticated animals were absent in the New World. You know, there were no draft animals. There were no, the domesticates were fairly few and fairly insignificant. The guinea pig, for example, was one, the turkey, but there were no equivalents of cattle or sheep, or, well, maybe the llamas of South America might have been somewhat equivalent to sheep, but the pigs weren't domesticated, even though they had peccaries here and so forth. So again, it was said that had there been any significant interactions, surely these sorts of things would have, these really valuable, wonderful crops that became so important after colonization from Europe began, would have accompanied any interactions. You know, why is there no rice, no wheat, or was there none prior to 1492? And no tobacco in the old world, or corn. You know, these things, these absences. The people that opposed transoceanic contacts and influences routinely cited these absences as proof of no contact. Furthermore, they pointed out that there are no, at least they alleged, there were no historical records of any such contacts. They said, well, if anything as significant as finding a new world happened, why certainly this would have been publicized all over the place back home, and we would have had historical records of these happenings, and we don't. Well, we do have a few actually somewhat ambiguous ones that could refer to such contacts. I'm not going to try to get into those here, but generally the record is not ample in terms of suggestions of such contacts. However, we have to keep in mind that unlike the era of colonization when, say, a Spaniard like Cortez, Pizarro, or whoever came to a new land, new to him, not new to the inhabitants, and wanted to claim it for Spain or Portugal or wherever, he'd plant the flag and say, I claim this country in the name of King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, or whoever it was reigning at the time. Somebody later than that, as far as those conquistadores were concerned. But that was that era, the era of colonization. You had to publicize what you'd done in order to make it seem legitimate. Earlier on, though, this was not the aim. Colonization was not the aim. What if there was an aim, if this happened at all, it wasn't for that purpose. It was probably for like trade. And so if you were in trade, in discovering new sources for valuable goods, you weren't going to publicize that. You were going to keep that under your hat as best you could. Secrecy was part of the game under those circumstances. So we shouldn't expect a lot in the way of the records. In any case, probably most of the voyaging was not state-sponsored. It was much more likely individual sponsored, or, you know, and again, why would they might even have been illiterate. They were much less producing historical records of what they wanted to keep secret in the first place. So it's not any great surprise that there is a general lack of such historical records. As I say, there are some records out there that could well be accounts of such encounters, but they're hard to interpret. It's also commonly said that, well, if there had been contacts, surely we would find something in the archaeological record, some artifacts from the old world turning up in the new world. And since we haven't found any, we have no reason to suppose that anybody from outside was here. Regarding that, first of all, the numbers of artifacts brought over and lost or given away or whatever would probably have been extremely minute in number. And so it'd be a needle in a haystack kind of operation to try to find such things. There have, in fact, been found a few such artifacts, but very few in really a good archaeological context. At least that's the case with what we call portable artifacts, those that you can carry around. And like an axe or a pot or whatever. And we find pretty minimal remains of that kind. We do have a terracotta head from undisturbed pyramid in Mexico that dates just about around the time of Columbus. We've got a few other things of that nature here and there, but not much. I have to admit, not much. Now, in addition to portable artifacts, there's what we call parietal artifacts. That means a non-portable artifact. And what first comes to mind in that regard is inscriptions. Now, sometimes inscriptions are on portable artifacts, but some are on rock faces. Now, where most of you all live, you've got petroglyphs galore, pictographs everywhere. And so you're quite familiar with these kinds of parietal artifacts. Now, most of that stuff, of course, was generated over the centuries and millennia by the native inhabitants of the region. But here and there in the New World, we do find inscriptions that seem not to be of Native American origin, but appear to be in old world alphabets or writing systems, non-alphabetical writing systems, or in some old world language. Now, the most famous of these, of course, is the Kensington runestone, a Norse inscription found up in Minnesota at the end of the 19th century. But that was widely called a hoax, still is often, but linguistic work on it has now shown, I think, with very great confidence that it is a genuine artifact, that the text is correct and is genuinely Norse and of the period, the 14th century. Other ones are more controversial. Of course, all of these are controversial to some extent because they're very hard to date directly. You have other runic inscriptions. You have inscriptions in southeast Colorado and the Oklahoma Panhandle that appear to be in Agam, which is a Celtic writing system, and some in what appears to be an Omani script from the Arabian Peninsula. These have had a lot of very excellent work done on them, but they have really garnered very little attention or acceptance in the professional realm of scholarship. And I think they've been unfortunately and unfairly overlooked. Right around in the upper Little Colorado area, as our participant here, John Ruskamp, can attest, there and elsewhere in the greater Southwest, John has identified several sites that have petroglyphs that are readable as ancient Chinese, probably Zhou Dynasty, more or less Chinese writing. And maybe after I've spoken, he might add a few words on that. I know some of you are familiar with this material. And although some of it is so simple, you could find other explanations for it. Some of it is so complex that I'm pretty open to its being genuine. This is pretty startling stuff. What were Chinese, if they were here, what were they doing here, back 500 BC or whatever, 700 BC or more? Or what were people from Oman scratching on cliffs in Colorado for? It doesn't, on the surface of it, it doesn't really sound very plausible. But we get a lot of surprises in scholarship. Sometimes it takes a while for them to sink in. So those are some general observations on criticisms of the idea of transoceanic influences and some of the responses to those. Maybe I'll show a couple of images at this point. So I guess I'll need to screen share. So I've clicked on screen share, clicked on my pictures, and are you seeing anything?
Yes, you need to actually start it. You're just in the edit mode.
So do I hit slideshow?
Yes,
Okay. Play from start.
play from start.
Okay, so it's just the title, so I'll skip on to that. I have to start out by plugging the book I wrote in 2017. If you find this fascinating and you have a spare $50, you can order one of these. But I want to show you this as the first substantive image. I'm going to pose a couple of questions to you. How wide? What's the narrowest distance by which land areas are separated in the Atlantic Ocean? Would you say 3,000 miles, 2,000 miles, 1,500 miles, 500 miles? The correct answer is 240 miles. Now, what am I talking about? Look at this map. Look at the upper right. Look at the North Atlantic. Now, you can't see it all, every little island here on this scale map, but you can see Scandinavia. You can see the British Isles. You can see Iceland and Greenland. In between Iceland and and Scotland, mainland Scotland, you have, of course, the Orkney Islands. You've got the Shetland Islands. Then you have Norway's the Faroe Islands that are further out in the North Atlantic, and then you have Iceland and Greenland. And it turns out that the greatest distance between any of those islands is 240 miles. So that's not exactly a daunting crossing. So we have always to keep in mind that at least in the North Atlantic, even without sail, you could get across a gap like that. So a lot of our problems are perceptional. We think of the Atlantic as it is in the middle of it, where the narrowest part of the middle of it between Africa and South America is, I think, 1,200 miles, something like that, which is big, but it's not overwhelmingly wide. The Pacific. Well, let's say, what's the minimum distance between Asia and North America? Well, of course, it's the Bering Strait, and it has an island, which has an island in the middle. So the greatest distance there is about 25 miles. You can cross the Pacific, as it were, in 25 miles. So always keep in mind these northern areas are really close. And this map that I'm showing here is Mercator's projection, which, as many of you know, it's good for some sorts of things, particularly for navigation plotting, but it's very poor for showing what we're trying to show here, because instead of converging toward the poles as the meridians of longitude really do, they're parallel to each other on the Mercator projection. They're not shown here, but that's the case. And so it shows these poleward areas as being much bigger and much farther apart than they are in reality. So that's part of our perceptual problem, because for a long period of time, even today, the Mercator's projection was a standard one you'd see in classrooms. The other thing to see on this map is all these arrows in the oceans. These arrows represent the principal surface currents, the movement of waters like rivers in the ocean, and they're generated by the prevailing winds. And so the prevailing winds are pretty much parallel to these arrows of the currents. And you have basically never-ending conveyor belts that connect the two hemispheres in all the oceans, or in both the oceans. And so oceans are not equally wide the mileage distance is not the only consideration or even the greatest consideration. What is of greatest consideration is the movement of the winds and waters. If you go with the winds and waters, you just get on the conveyor belt and it takes you right across. If you try to go against them, you won't get anywhere, at least in a sailing ship or a smaller craft. So not only are these conveyor belts that make it inevitable, they impel voyages, at least if the ship was dismasted or something, and it would just get automatically carried across. And so there must have been hundreds of instances of unintentional crossings from earliest time of use of significant watercraft. So it's not a matter of was there any contact before Columbus? There had to have been. The other thing about these gyres, as they're called, these ever circling systems, is that you do, because you can't go against them, you have to go with them. So you have to know where they are. And so the discovery of these, we don't know how early that was, but the discovery of those was key to creating permanent connections between the hemispheres. Knowledge of them may have gone way back in time. One of our problems is we tend to be so Eurocentric that we don't realize that some other parts of the world were much more advanced in their knowledge in many of these things than Europeans were in the Middle Ages and before. All right. Let me go to the next one. The whole question of the adequacy of watercraft in earlier times, that whole myth of it waited until the 1400s before ships got to be adequate to cross the ocean. That was never the case, even in Europe. But European ships were way behind in many instances, in many cases, in many aspects. However that may have been, in some parts of the world, there have been for thousands of years entirely adequate watercraft. I've shown here just as an example, a reconstruction of a Phoenician trading ship. The Phoenicians, were active, 1200 BC and later as Carthaginians in North Africa for, up to the Romans did them in, the Punic Wars and all of that. You can see these ships are very well made, very well designed, handsome vessels. They had only this one square rigged sail, which is not the ideal sail for trying to go against the wind. In the islands of Indonesia and in the coasts of China and Southeast Asia, they did have much more efficient sails that could do much better against the wind than European ones could, up until Europeans went out and colonized Southeast Asia and learned about these sails and took them back home and created yachting. So we have to avoid our ethnocentrism in a lot of these things. Let me just consult my notes here for a moment. From pretty much the beginning of my interest and study of the possibilities and likelihoods of transoceanic contacts, starting back in the 60s, 1960s, not the 1860s. I've kind of organized my approach to it sort of as the classic approach of a lawyer in a criminal case. You've all probably read detective stories and know about motive, means, and opportunity. That's the approach I've taken here. What we've been speaking of primarily now, up to this point, is means. How would they have gotten across? Well, now I think I've given you some idea. I mean, not just Phoenician ships, but the junks of China. They were much more efficient than the European ships of the time. And there were many others. Of course, the Polynesians They very clearly went all the way across the Pacific. And not in really early times, but they did make it with a Neolithic level culture. The means were there. I haven't talked about navigational means. They used celestial navigation, non-instrumental, didn't need sextants and compasses and charts and all that sort of thing, because they could sail by the stars. The professional sailors of the Pacific, of the pre-colonial Pacific, memorized dozens, hundreds even of stars. Many of them didn't even have names, but they knew them and they knew where they were. But they had, 100, 150, or maybe even more named stars and constellations, other features. And so they were familiar with the heavens. They had the capability of using the elevation of a star above the horizon at its apex for determining latitude. I'm not going to try to go into the technical details here, but I can assure you that their celestial navigation was totally adequate to know within a degree or 2 degrees at the most of where they were in terms of latitude. Longitude was harder, but if we're talking about two hemispheres, you don't need to be very exact to hit someplace on that coast, between Alaska and Tierra del Fuego or whatever. So longitude was not as significant as latitude was. And what they do to compensate for the rather rough estimate of longitude that they could make, they would do latitude sailing. That is to say, if they were going to say some small Pacific island, they knew the latitude of it, they'd head for some point clearly to the east or to the west of that island. And then when they reached the latitude, they'd turn and sail down the latitude until they hit the target. So they had all sorts of little clever ways of finding their way around using sea marks, like the angle of the line of the crests of the swells and waves, things like that. To me, it's really fascinating what they were able to do with no instruments at all, much less GPS. So that's means. Motives. Why would anybody have, in his right mind or her right mind, and it was mostly men, let's face it, that sail way out into unknown waters, thousands of miles. The Central Pacific is 10,000 miles wide. The Atlantic is, as I say, only about 1,200, but still that's not insubstantial. So why would anybody want to do that? Well, we do recognize, I think, probably particularly in groups like this one, the human instinct for exploration. Steve Elkins, he can tell you all about that. And we want to know what's around the bend, what's over the horizon, so there's that to begin with. We've got to know. We've got to find out. Not everybody has that, but a significant number of a proportion of the population does. The other reasons, include the hope. Well, in geography, there are what we call, for migration, there are what we call push factors and pull factors. Push factors are those that impel you to leave wherever you are and go somewhere else. A conflict of whatever kind, shortages, starvation, overpopulation, embarrassment even, these things have been the motive for people leaving. Those are push factors. Pull factors are attractants, things that cause you to want to go see them or get them or bring them back or whatever. And among these things is trade. And merchants in the old days, just a few voyages, even if they lost some ships, they could make so much money on a single voyage, say from Egypt to South India, and bring back trade goods. They could make their fortune and have a comfortable rest of their life. And so, especially in places where people were generally poor anyway, there was tremendous motivation for expanding horizons, finding new sources of desirable goods. And so what would cause anybody to quit looking? In fact, as things became more and more familiar, as discoveries followed discoveries, people would have to go farther and farther to find new things. And, I think they would have done it. I think people are kind of like gas, which expands to fill all available volume. Humans expand their purview to explore all geographic space that they can get to and survive in. And they would have, if transoceanic voyages, you'd have to have a pretty valuable and low weight and bulk kind of product to make it worthwhile with that long distance. But there were some such products. I mean, precious materials, whether they were precious metals or gemstones, are one possibility. Drug plants of various kinds, hallucinogens, for instance, and medicinals, aromatics, like frankincense and myrrh, for instance, or copal in the New World. Metals and so forth. These could all be products that could profitably be traded even across oceans. And we know that the Greek sailors who lived in Alexandria, Egypt, during the pre-Roman era, they began a trans-Indian Ocean voyaging, and the Romans took that over when they conquered Egypt. There were hundreds of ships ultimately going across the Indian Ocean every year, going on the monsoon winds out on one leg of it, and then the winds would shift seasonally, come back on the other monsoon, and they would sail distances down the Red Sea and then out through the Gulf of Aden and directly across the Indian Ocean to South India, a distance greater than that distance from Africa to Brazil. So if they could do it in the Indian Ocean, they could do it in the Atlantic. The Mediterranean ships sailed all up and down the Mediterranean. In fact, you had Spanish wine in Roman times, Spanish wine being traded all the way to South India. That's a distance probably double the width of the Atlantic. And in Greek and Roman ships. So there was nothing intrinsically to prevent crossings of at least the Atlantic and probably the Pacific either. Okay, so that gets that is something about motives and means. What about opportunity? That means, in a criminal sense, that means, did the person have the opportunity to do the dirty deed? Was he there on the spot so he could do it? What I mean by that in this context is, do we have any hard evidence, irrefutable hard evidence that's not cultural, that's not subject to interpretation, that proves that there in fact were contacts, interhemispheric contacts? And the short answer to that is yes, in abundance. And this is very clear, and yet it's so little known out there in the world of scholarship that it's hard to make any headway. It's hard to convince people even to look, because they think it's just all totally, most people, not everybody, but most people out there in scholarship think it's really ridiculous. Or if there were contacts, which there may have been, yeah, but still, they couldn't have had any impact because they didn't involve so few people that there wouldn't be any influence, and so on and so on. So what do we find that does prove that there were significant interactions? Mostly we have biological evidence. And most of that evidence is in the form of cultivated plants and perhaps a couple of domesticated birds, the turkey and the chicken. To make a very long story short with respect to these, some of my colleagues and I have identified in the archaeology of both hemispheres, maybe 20 to 30 species of cultivated plants, and at least the chicken that are archaeologically attested in impeccable contexts in the archaeology in both hemispheres, particularly in India, but also in the New World, particularly in the Andean region of South America. These domesticates are unable to, with maybe one or two maybe exceptions, but still iffy. But the great bulk of them are totally unable not only to cross oceans on their own, they can't leap oceans, they can't float across oceans, they can't be carried by birds across oceans. They can only be carried by humans. And beyond that, in most cases, domesticates cannot survive on their own. So if they did accidentally get drifted over and landed on the shore and happened, to get up above the tide line and take root, they couldn't compete with the local wild vegetation, and they would die out within a generation. So there's no chance that most of these plants were carried by natural means. So humans had to take them. So if humans had to take them, humans had to be there. So that's biological evidence that is not cultural, and it can't really be plausibly disputed. There's other biological evidence. We have intestinal parasites, old world tropical and subtropical intestinal parasites that we also find in tropical and subtropical America in archaeological contexts, going as far back as the 7th millennium BC. Now that's a long time ago. That started even us diehard lifetime diffusionists, which we call ourselves because it refers to the diffusion and spread of culture. So it goes startlingly far back in time. We also have some beetles that are shared by the two hemispheres archaeologically before Columbus. We have some genetic evidence, rather convincing to me. It's not in mitochondrial DNA or anything like that, and I'll tell you why in a second. It's in other genetic systems like HLAs, human leukocyte antigens. These are blood factors that are very numerous in their variations and therefore very good at pinning down the geography of movement of humans. Again, it's very technical, so I won't try to get into detail there. I said I explained why mitochondrial DNA doesn't help us much in this context. We don't find, other than the initial settling populations DNAs from Asia, we don't find in American Indians mitochondrial DNA of the old world. I mentioned earlier in the talk that mostly it was men that went on these expeditions. Very rarely would there have been women involved. Mitochondrial DNA, as you may recollect, is passed down exclusively through the female line. And so you can't inherit your father's mitochondrial DNA. So if only men came over, and even if they went wild with the natives, they weren't passing on any mitochondrial DNA. I remember one popular article that raised the question of, if there were contacts, why wasn't there mtDNA? It was kind of amusing to see how he completely missed the fact that the men can't pass it on. Okay, I'm getting towards the climax here, and I just wanted to make an observation or two about the significance of this whole issue. Why is it significant? What is it? Who cares? Well, maybe you don't have to care. I find it intrinsically interesting. If we want to know the true history of humankind, we've got to get it right. And that it's hugely different, the perception of everybody staying home and everybody going everywhere. as far as world history is concerned. The other thing is the implications it has for a theory of cultural evolution. Did everybody everywhere that shares various cultural traits invent them all on their own? Or was there a historical connection among these different occurrences that represents humans moving around, migrating, trading all over the place? For understanding culture change, cultural evolution, if you will, we have to find out what actually happened, and then we can, on firmer ground, perhaps construct a theory of cultural change. All right, I'm going to draw it to a close there, and I hope and expect there'll be questions. So I will try to get rid of this. Well, let me just show, before I quit, let me give you a few more images, because I do have some. I usually just talk without images, but where's my cursor? I don't seem to find it here. Okay. Regarding the presence of foreigners in the New World, I'm showing you some pictures of sculptures that show what looked like non-Native American physical types. What strikes me on the left as Negroid, same with the center one, that Olmec head. The right-hand one looks Caucasoid. The two right-hand ones are from the Olmec country in Mexico. The left-hand one is from Veracruz in Mexico, where there are quite a few sculptures in Veracruz that look, physiognomies look foreign. Here's some from other places. The right-hand and left-hand ones, I can't see the left-hand one very well. It's covered up with something, but they look at least partially Caucasoid to me. The one in the middle is a Maya one with a big non-Maya nose and a bushy pointed beard there. Those are not Maya physical characteristics. So I just show you those. And then all of the cultural comparisons. There are many, many, many. I lost one I was going to show you, but here's another one. These are comparing pins. The left-hand ones are from Andean South America or Northwest South America. The right-hand ones in each set are from Asia, particularly, I think, from a Dong Son culture in Vietnam. And you can see they're almost identical, and a whole series of them. So are those going to pop up here and there by chance? I doubt it. Okay, that's it. And I'll stop the sharing.
Okay.
Got you back, Richard?
Yes. Well, I'm really excited about your talk. You explained everything extremely well. I totally enjoyed it.
Thank you. I always get excited presenting this kind of stuff because it's pretty fascinating.
Yes, it is. And, it is hard to believe that there was no contact. I mean, to me, it's hard to believe that we were separated and had no contact at all.
Yeah, well, it is for me, but you'd be amazed. Maybe you would be amazed what a large percentage of academia doesn't share your view.
Well, that is true, and we're finding all kinds of evidence and making discoveries, and hopefully we'll bring more light to the subject and get the word out.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else have a question for Steve or a comment to make?
This is Steve Elkins. I'm going to make a comment. I really enjoyed that, Steve. I think you did a very concise job, very logical, easy to follow. I loved it.
Good. Thank you.
I just want to say to the group, regarding traveling across the oceans, there are so many people who have crossed all the oceans in ancient watercraft, or modern versions of ancient watercraft. And in fact, just in the last year, there's a member of the Explorers Club who single-handedly rowed a canoe from Crescent City, California to the Philippines successfully by himself. All right, so that's now, it's kind of a high-tech canoe because he had advantage of some technologies, but he was able to row across the Pacific Ocean, going at the right time of year, following the winds and the currents. And I talked to him. He had a satellite link on his canoe, and he was in a storm, and it blew him 500 miles off course, and he lost a lot of time, but he survived. All right. So the same thing could have happened in the past. Also, just recently, there was a team of 4 young women that are rowers, a rowing team, and they rowed in record time, these 4 young ladies, from California to Hawaii in 32 days nonstop. 2 of them would sleep while 2 would row, and 2 would sleep and 2 would row. They did it all by themselves, unassisted, in a rowboat. Not a rowboat you go out in a little lake in, obviously, but a boat you can row. So if they can do that, people could have crossed the oceans for a very, very long time. Steve also showed a picture of a Phoenician ship, and I know a fellow in England who likes this subject, and he built a 2,500-year-old Phoenician boat in the same style, the same materials, and he sailed it successfully from Carthage to Fort Lauderdale in 2019. So there's many, many instances of this happening, proving that the means were definitely there. Now, people may say, just because you have the means doesn't mean you did it, but I think in human behavior, if you got the way to do something, someone's going to do it. But, anybody else comment on that?
Amen.
That's what I have to say.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I agree with you entirely. And these small boat voyages, solo voyages, and so on, there have been hundreds of them, and involving everybody from teenagers to septuagenarians doing solo trips across the oceans. I mean, in tiny craft, one across the Atlantic, 5.5 foot boat, for example. And you mentioned experimental voyages too, like Beale's Phoenician ship. And there have been a multitude of other replica traditional watercraft constructed and sailed, proving in abundance that these craft were completely capable of going anywhere. So that is important.
Well, that is definitely true. And also, you get a fisherman from, say, Japan, gets blown out into the ocean, and the oceanic currents would automatically bring him over to the American coast in California.
Indeed, and there were dozens of them that happened to, that had been recorded since the 18th century, and on the Pacific coast, Japanese junks getting dismasted and coming all the way across, drifting. And of course, the tsunami that happened a few years ago in northern Japan, debris from that has been arriving regularly on the northwest coast for a few years now.
Well,
John Ruskamp, you want to say something about all the stuff you've been looking at for these decades?
oh, there's a nice one. John, I think you're on mute.
He's very good at sign language.
Yeah.
Unmute. There.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
Okay. Yeah, building on that theme a little bit. Can you see the glyphs here
Yes.
that are on my screen?
Yes.
In the upper left hand, you see a square with a plus sign in it.
TN.
Up here. Can you see that cursor?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. That is a meow. That is an ancient Chinese symbol. There it is there from a textbook, from a lexicon. Very unique and very complicated. It is used by the Miao people of southeastern China. they're down in around the mainland in Taiwan, down to Laos, and the countries bordering the ocean down there. So they're a nautical people. Now, in my own research out at near Springerville, I came upon these glyphs, which are readable. And they're numbered 1 down here and not 2, but that means second in Chinese. So they're working between, what do you call it, cardinal and ordinal number patterns here. They're not saying 1 and 2, they're saying 1 and second, which is curious. But at any rate, these are readable. And in that Miao modern Fujian China dialect, these form a rhyme. This one up here is particularly interesting because it's teeth, meaning to speak. And when you see it that way, it's teeth, it begins to jump out at you. Well, at any rate, I've been able to pass these off to a nice gal over in, here's the Fujian region of China. So they're ocean-going people. This gal here at the Institute of History and Biology in Taiwan has verified that they are readable and they are, in that dialect, a poem. So what we have come up with, here's another one that's out at the very same site. That's a prisoner. That's very ancient Chinese. It's a prisoner. Oops. Well, it shrunk, but there's the actual glyph at the same site. So we do have oceanic people. We do have oceanic writings on the rocks out there in Arizona. I'll leave it at that.
I know there's Bing Lee who's participating here. She may not say anything.
Yeah, I'm still here. Yeah.
She knows John, she knows Richard, and she knows Stephen. And she has personally seen some of these petroglyphs. And I was with her when she saw some, so was Richard. And she was somewhat skeptical at first, but she did see some things that kind of blew her mind when she saw it. Maybe you want to comment on what your thoughts are, pro or con.
You can turn your video on, Bing.
Okay. Where is
Or you
me?
can hide.
Okay, I turned me myself. Okay. Where is the video?
Lower left-hand corner.
Oh,
Yeah, put your cursor down to the turn video on.
can you
Lower
hear
left.
me? Can you hear me?
Yes,
That's
yes,
fine. Okay, so I can talk anyway. So you can hear me, right?
yes.
So yes, I went to New Mexico with Steve Elkins, and also I met Richard there, and I saw this exactly the rock now behind John Ross Camp. So this one is the most convincible one to me because this one piece of rock has so many Chinese image on the surface of it, which are so complicated, Chinese characters. Because we also, saw a lot of simple ones like a tian, right? A square with a cross in the middle, something like that. We saw a lot of things like that. But to me, I always feel like it might have been made by somebody just randomly by accident. But things like this, behind, John Ruscombe now, which are so complicated, I don't think this was made by somebody just randomly or by accident. And also we saw an image, it's called very, very complicated image. It's called FU, Fu. Fu is complicated, image in Chinese caricature. And also it's so meaningful because I was so surprised when I saw that single image. I'm so sorry I didn't have the image in my, I can show you later. Because this food is so special, before the Chinese New Year Eve, so every household in China will put that, we post that image on their door, because the food means good luck, good fortune. So that's very, very traditional Chinese caricature. If it's something else, some other caricatures, I might not be so excited. But this one, the single one, nothing else on that rock. That's only a single, food is on that rock, which is so complicated to be, like carved there. That's so, so impressive to me, because like I said, it's not a simple image. And also it's a so meaningful image. So that's why, right. Who's posting this? Right, this one.
That's me.
Oh, John, thank you.
Yeah.
Right. I was so, impressed and so surprised, because I never imagined I can see this word on the rock. That in China, even now, if you go to China before the Chinese Lunar New Year, every household you go, you can see this exact character there. So that's why it's so meaningful, so exciting, image to me.
Well, I've been trying to figure that one out for at least a decade, at least 10
You
years.
should have asked me.
When you walked up and I saw you, we were doing it over with our cell phones, and you were so excited, and you were able to break the code and recognize it immediately.
It's so obvious, so easy, because I also sent this image, this picture back to China, to my coworkers, to my relatives, to my family. No matter, kids are like teenagers or old, like 18 years old, senior people. They always, they just, recognize it immediately. Hey, this is a fool.
A tremendous discovery.
Right, this one is something,
priceless.
I think worth our trip there.
Yes, and like you say, it's very complex.
Right, exactly. That's a very complicated one.
Yeah, but thank you for that discovery.
Oh, I'm so happy to share with you guys. Hopefully you guys can understand me.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
Steve, what do you think about that character, the Chinese character that's being found?
Well, I don't know Chinese writing, so I can't really pass judgment on it. But I think the principal takeaway with respect to what John has, and now with the assistance of Bing, has been revealing, is that Albuquerque, New Mexico series of characters, which forms a coherent message, includes complex logographs, and apparently even conveys poetry. And I mean, that can't be fortuitous. I'm pretty convinced by that one.
Well, I guess we need, unfortunately, as you mentioned earlier, because I've been looking, obviously, I've been researching this for quite a while myself with Bing. There's no scientifically valid way to date the petroglyphs. You can get kind of a circumstantial date, but you can't nail it 100%. No one's come up with a way to do that. It's kind of complicated. And John knows my frustration because I've discussed it often with him, the ways, but no one's come up with it. So you have, again, I guess that's the whole problem with a lot of this stuff, is you have to just use common sense and go, if it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, it's probably a duck.
Well, yes, Steve, and if I may jump in there for a second, the interesting thing about, like, in the background behind my head here, those Chinese characters are dateable by their style. They go with a certain era in Chinese history. So in that sense, the form of the writings gives you the date.
Well, I agree with you in that, but that's still not 100%, because you could say, well, sometime in the not too distant past, somebody who knew that stuff came in and did it. I mean, that's what it's.
So this image behind John Roskamp, right? I sent this picture to the Chinese expert, who is the expert of oracle bone. So they said that, these are so alike Chinese oracle bone image. Even they couldn't say exactly they are, just 100%, but they said they are so alike. That's the only thing they can say. Like I use, Steve Jett said, we cannot date it, right? But they, based on the appearance, the image, the way, they just draw the stroke. They said they are so alike Chinese oracle bone image.
Yeah, and David Heatley, before he passed away, he was considered by many the foremost authority in oracle bone out of UC Berkeley. Actually read that and pointed out a few of the characters to me. I didn't know what they were, but he did, and he verified that. I've got his emails to this day. So, and also, importantly, not to be overlooked, oracle bone was lost to mankind between about 500 BC maybe till 1899 AD. So if it's a forgery, it has to be newer than 1899, and they don't appear to be.
Well, that's why I say if it looks like a duck and talks like a duck, it's probably a duck. But, it's not like if you have a carbon date, there's no refuting it. Because there'll always be somebody who'll argue, even if all the circumstantial evidence points in that direction. There'll always be somebody saying, well, there could have been this oddball scholar in 1902 went there, carved it in there. So that's all I'm saying.
That's true.
I think that all the people in Richard's group out in Arizona who are looking at petroglyphs and various things, you got to keep your eyeballs open. And maybe this, you've learned something and you look for these different shapes in petroglyphs, or you'll find something that can help move this forward. Because you're in a part of the country, there's still lots of things to find.
Take
Right.
them with you.
Steve Elkins, if you'll turn your video on, we haven't been able to see your face for a little bit.
There I am.
There you go. Well, that is true. I mean, I don't speak Chinese. I don't read Chinese. But if I go out and I find a petroglyph that you look at it and you scratch your head and why did somebody make something like this? That's a good candidate to be possibly Chinese or some other writing system.
Well, if you do find it, take a picture and send it to all of us.
Well, that's exactly what I did. And on our trip to Albuquerque, I showed Bing a picture that I took in Winslow at the Homology ruins. And she took one instant look at it and yes, it means early. I mean, she didn't have to think about it, or she just read it. You remember that one, Bing?
Yes. But, I'm very skeptical. If something, some image which are so simple, too simple, so I wouldn't say they are exactly Chinese, because like I said, they might have been made by somebody by accident. But if some image are very complicated, right, I think, that's so exciting. So, convincible.
Yeah, and one last comment I'll make on the background behind my head here. Those images there have the proper syntax. They read in the proper order for an ancient sacrificial Chinese recording from that time period. So not only do you have what many seem to identify as oracle bone or Bronze era scripts there, but they're in the proper order, the proper syntax. So somebody would have had to know that to forge it. And that is not known until very recently, when it was rediscovered and interpreted.
Well, that's why we keep on studying this. I'd like to say one other thing to the group, that Stephen Jett was unknowingly an inspiration to me to pursue this subject. Back in 1970, when I was a college student, I had an anthropology textbook called Man Across the Sea, in which Stephen and other of his colleagues had written their papers and their ideas about transoceanic contacts in pre-Columbian times. It was very controversial at the time, but I guess my anthropology professors were very progressive and they made us read it. I knew nothing about it, but I read it and I became fascinated as hell. And here, all these years later, it's always been noodling around in the back of my head. And in the last couple of years, I've decided I wanted to pursue that. Unfortunately, my friend Bing Lee, who's a writer from China originally, liked the subject, and she's trying to research it and push the needle forward on this. There she is.
There
I have
she,
this book too.
Yeah. So, Stephen, you have to know that your influence goes for more than half a century.
No, naturally, I feel gratified.
Yeah.
Bing, you have to be talking for the camera to switch over to you if you want to show your book.
Oh, really? You didn't see it?
Yeah, you have to actually be talking.
Oh, okay. So can you see it now?
Yes.
Man,
The
across the sea.
I found
Talk-
it from internet. It's an old version. It's an old edition. I love this. The 1970s one.
Oh, okay.
Now,
So Stephen's been studying the subject for a very, very long time.
Yeah, and I haven't convinced very many people in that 50 years.
oh,
Two.
What about the
I'd
other
argue
people in the
that.
group? Is this of interest to them?
What's
The other
that?
people in the Agave group? Do you find this fascinating? Are you not interested? I'm curious.
Well, I find it very fascinating because we do have so many petroglyphs out here, and to know that possibly it could be from centuries before that we even thought that there were, Native Americans putting those petroglyphs on there. It's very fascinating having that evidence.
Maybe you'll find some more.
I hope so.
Yeah. Yes, we're looking all the time. And one thing I might add to it is these petroglyphs last a very long time. The Anasazis were here somewhere around the 1350 to 1400 era. But yet we do find petroglyphs that date back 5,000-6,000 years, maybe even back further than that. So it's not just one group. When you see petroglyphs, they're not of one era.
There's a lot to be learned. And thankfully, the academic world is beginning to change their attitude. As Steve mentioned, when he went to school and when I went to school, most of us went to school, they said Columbus discovered America, blah, blah, blah. And they said everyone came over the Bering Strait in the beginning. Well, now they're even backpedaling on that and calling it the Kelp Highway. And they actually, because ocean levels were lower, they know that now. And they took boats across the ocean, and more people came across on boats because it was a heck of a lot faster and probably a heck of a lot higher survival rate than trying to cross all that land and make it all the way down to Tierra del Fuego. Easier just to go across the ocean in a month or two. So there's a lot of interesting things happening, and thankfully, due to new technologies, young marine archaeologists are making some incredible discoveries in areas that used to be above the ocean in our older coastlines and are now submerged, sometimes in a couple 100 feet of water, and they're finding ancient settlements like crazy all over the world. So the story is really just beginning. And Steve Jett and his colleagues were the pioneers.
hey, now, Steve, are you?
John Ruskamp too. So.
Oh, well, I just happened to be there, but Bing made a good find also. I'll tell you, it's the whole group. It's a synergy. But Steve, are you updating your book now? Are you revising a new edition? Is that in the works?
No, I'm not doing any tinkering with that one. They haven't even put out yet the paperback version of this one, which they are supposed to do. Haven't heard anything, but I've got two more sequel books nearly finished, and so there'll be more and not overlapping very much at all with what I've already published. So if I'm spared, as they say, you may have some additional reading assignments ahead.
Well, I think we're all looking forward to that.
Oh, absolutely.
New books be really just new versions of what you've written because you've got new information and new ideas.
No, looking at different aspects of it that really have very little to do with what I wrote about in that first book.
Oh,
There's so much to this topic. The one I'm working on particularly now, it looks at something about the history of ideas concerning this debate, but then it gets into all of the what I consider stupid statements that so many academic types have made over the years about this business, and very nasty comments and so on. I think they're going to look pretty bad if I can get somebody to publish it. And then getting into the theoretical implications for the theory of culture change that I referred to early in this talk. And then the one after that, the book after that, is going to get into the specifics, like which technologies owe what to overseas inputs and so on and so on.
what's an example of a stupid comment? Can you put one again?
I'm too stupid to remember anything exact.
Well, I can add a comment that was made by Joseph Needham, who was quite a sinologist in his day. He said, how much evidence does it take to prove that one thing came from another? He was so frustrated with the negativity to his idea of trans-Pacific, transocean contact that he just came right out and said, well, how much proof does it take?
Yeah. And Needham espousing all of that, what was a major coup, you might say. And that was promoted, as you may or may not know, by somebody that some of you here know, not the Heber people, but some of the outsiders here. Alice Kehoe organized way back in, I don't know when, the 80s, I guess, a ambulant conference in Mesoamerica showing Needham and his wife all this stuff that looked so Chinese and so on, and they were convinced pretty thoroughly.
Well, another one of your colleagues, I can't think of her name offhand right now, who wrote the Sunni Enigma.
Oh yeah, Nancy Yaw Davis.
Nancy Yaw Davis. She had a hypothesis that Japanese came over in the 1200s and somehow made it over to where the modern day Zuni are, and they interfaced with them. And Richard was with us, so was Bing. So we decided to go there to see. I read her book, and it's very plausible, very interesting. And I met with the young historian in Zuni who said, yeah, this seems very possible to me. I believe it. However, the elders all had different stories, and I found the Zuni are very political, and they don't always tell you what you want. They got their own versions of history that change all the time. But there is some compelling evidence in the language and in the iconic art that says it's possible. And I read not a short time ago that some archaeologists carbon dated a skeleton in the Marquesas Islands in the South Pacific, and they found indigenous American DNA in that skeleton. And that's pretty solid proof. So that means somewhere back in the 1200s, somebody went which way? They went somewhere.
And they found it in Easter Island too.
What?
All the DNA is in Easter Island also. Yeah, so they were out there.
Kind of hard to argue against that. And that's where the new technologies are making the story easier and easier to decipher. It's very exciting.
Yeah.
So I'll shut up, let other people talk.
Steve, well, Elkins, you were asking our group if they enjoyed the talk, and a lot of them are texting in and saying yes, they very, very much enjoyed it.
Good. I aim to entertain.
Right. Good job, Stephen. It's good to see you, and I really like listening to what you have to say. You're always so damn logical.
Yeah, well, thank you. And it's very reinforcing to have some positive feedback from you guys and gals. So thank you.
Greatly
All right, well,
appreciate it.
I guess if we're done, we're done. Or
Yeah, I was going to say we better leave a little bit for another talk at another date. This has all been very interesting, and we all very much enjoyed it. And if anybody wants to say anything before I close, I'll wait a few minutes and then I'll shut the meeting down.
So Richard,
Yes.
did you invite Alice Kehoe?
Could I, you say?
Did you invite Alice?
Okay. I don't know, Alice.
I sent her a notice, but only this afternoon, so
Oh, did you
She's
invite
not
her?
available.
Okay. I will, this is recorded and I will put it on YouTube. So people will be able to see this in the future.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
and yeah, Richard, if you would send me a file of it.
Yes. So it'll be available within a few days on YouTube. It'll be on my channel with my name, Richard Gonsalves, and it'll be the Agave House chapter.
Okay,
So-
I got it.
Great. Yeah, we definitely want to download that so we can have it for our records. And we can
Yes.
say, Stephen Jett said this on this date. Therefore,
Yes, well, this has been so stimulating for me, and even though it's approaching bedtime, I'm not sure I'll be able to sleep right away.
Well, you had me excited. I don't know whether I'll sleep tonight or not either. So,
Sorry about that.
Very, very true. It's nice to see everyone and everyone healthy and very good. Thanks, Steve.
Thank you very much, Steve. We really
thank you for putting this
appreciate it.
together, Richard.
Thank you. Thank you. Good night.
all right. Well, with that, good night, everybody, and I'll end the meeting.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye.